Have a few things going on this week, this month, today. Like I said earlier, our theme for the month is curiosity, and that's always kind of a fun word to me. It's also Mother's Day, and then there are also things going on in the news. And so this morning, I woke up and I was like, okay, well, curiosity is kind of a fun word, and I was expecting to kind of have a fun, lighthearted service about curiosity on Mother's Day, and I usually do a service about beauty. And then, this week also there was a lot in the news that I think we can't just ignore, and so I'm going to kind of combine things a little bit, and we'll see if it works. But we'll start with the word curiosity, because there's a lightness to it in my mind. It's kind of a fun word. It kind of makes me happy. It's the idea of we never stop looking around us and looking at the world in awe, and what does this mean, and how do we make sense of that? And children are just naturally curious. And then, as Maya was talking about with nurturing, it's a beautiful thing when we're nurturing a child's curiosity. And I wrote in the newsletter this week a little story that I've heard, and I've shared it before probably, but there's this little story about a little child who was drawing a picture. And her mom said, "What are you drawing?" And she said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." "Oh," said the mom, "nobody really knows what God looks like." "Well," said the little girl, "that's because I'm not done yet." Right? Just the beautiful innocence and curiosity, and yet the inner knowing of children. It's really a beautiful thing to see. And it's true, right? Like I think children do know what God looks like until we show them, until we tell them, until we stifle their expression and their understanding and their curiosity, and we substitute their understanding with our own models, our own misunderstandings, our own cynicism or hurt. And then what happens is they either substitute their inner knowing for ours, even though we don't really know, or they simply quietly shut down that sense of curiosity and replace it with the realism of the outer world. So we have a tendency in this culture to substitute our own internal knowing for somebody else's authority. And sometimes that sense of wonder never comes back. And then what happens is many of us end up relying on somebody else's expertise and authority for most of our lives. But I don't think that's how it's meant to be. And so what I was thinking about when I was writing the newsletter article is, what if we decide to bring that sense of wonder and curiosity back into our own lives? What if we raise our children in such a way that they never lose that intuitive knowing in the first place? In a way that encourages and embraces the questions and rewards their curiosity? What if instead of placing our understanding of reality onto our children, we nurture their own inherent wisdom? What if we open up our own sense of curiosity again? It's never too late to look around you and be in a sense of wonder or awe. It's never too late to be curious about something. And I've probably shared this story before, and I wrote it in my newsletter article, that we were talking about, Peg was just talking about Wanda and Wes. Well, we have another beloved congregant who's no longer with us, Dwayne and Arlita, and they were a lovely, beautiful couple. And Arlita was more of an atheist, and she didn't come to my Building Your Own Theology classes. But Dwayne never missed one. And not long before he died, I asked him one day why he kept coming year after year, because it was the same thing somewhat. And he smiled and he said, Arlita decided that she was an atheist and she was done with it. I'm still not finished with it. I'll die one of these days and I still won't be finished. That, to me, is the beauty, the wonder, the sense of curiosity, of never stopping learning. I don't know if that's grammatically correct, but we don't want to ever stop learning. It doesn't matter how old we are. We don't want to stop growing. We want to nurture that in the children, but then why not nurture that in the teenagers? And then why not nurture that in the young adults? And then why not nurture that in the middle-aged adults? And then why not nurture that as we grow older into our final years and decades of life? Why don't we just keep nurturing all of that? And so that is part of the energy that I want to bring in today, right? There is, with the concept of curiosity and awakening curiosity, there's kind of an innocence, there's an openness, there's an optimism about that. And I want us to be able to keep our optimism, because what I said is I also want to address something that's not quite as optimistic today. And it's what's going on in the world, what happened with the Supreme Court with the Voting Rights Act, what is happening in Tennessee and Louisiana, and I'm not sure, but on my Facebook feed there's something going on in Alabama too. It's disheartening, and I feel like we're going backwards a little bit. I've been working in justice issues for most of my professional life, but I was raised as a middle-class white child, and I'm still a middle-class white woman, and I have the privilege to be somewhat naive about what the world is really like. And so my invitation for us is to be curious about what might the world really be like for people who are outside of this kind of white bubble of privilege. And it kind of came real for me this week. I have a friend who is a chaplain in Denver, and we have chaplain meetings occasionally, and he's from Nigeria. He's one of the kindest, nicest, wisest people I know. He has a beautiful family, and his children go to a charter school in Denver, and his daughter's 10 and is on the volleyball team. And he came to our chaplain meeting so shook up. He said, I just got back. He wasn't there. His wife and his daughters had just gotten back from their volleyball game. And this is 10-year-olds. His daughter was the only little girl that never got put into play. She's the only black child on that team. That is like pre-civil rights They were devastated. He was devastated. I've never known him to use race as anything. So he went on Friday and was going to talk to the teacher. And so he did. He went and talked to the teacher. I asked him yesterday, how did it go? Well, she apologized, because these are the teachers that are also the coaches. But then they had a volleyball game on Friday night, and the same thing happened. This is 2026. And it's Denver. And I don't know what to do with that. Because I come from, I guess, a somewhat naive position of white privilege, in that I get to pretend that that kind of thing is not happening in this world, in this year. Except I can't pretend that that's not happening when I watch it happen to my friend. They're thinking about leaving the country. And that will be our loss. That will be our loss, and it will be unnecessary. And how many other stories just like that are happening right now in this country? Because we weren't ready for a black woman, and instead we'd rather have a racist white man. I don't even know what to say to that. I don't even know what to say to that. Because it's not about politics. It's not about Democrat versus Republican. It's not. And then I also kind of made the mistake of reading a lovely book. It's a charming book, but I thought it was going to be lighthearted. And it was kind of lighthearted, but it kind of wasn't. It's this lovely book called Lessons in Chemistry. And I read that this week too at the same time. And it's about a brilliant woman in the 1950s, and she's a chemist. But it's about the way that she was treated simply because she was a woman in the science field in the 1950s. And once again, I'm Generation X. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s when all of this work had been done. All of these foundations had been laid in front of me and my generation. And I got to grow up in a world where women really could be anything they wanted to be. I got to grow up in a world where, you know, the MTV, the music videos, at least in theory, were "We Are the World, we are the children." We saw music videos of people of all different races and genders. And that was the world that I grew up in, thinking that that's what I was going to. And I was naive. And reading that book reminded me of what it was like for my grandmother, and what it was like for the women before her. And I remember my mother, who's in her 80s, telling me that when she went to college and was getting her, you know, thinking about. She was told, the women her generation were told, she could be a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or a flight attendant. And she was not tall enough to be a flight attendant. So she ended up being a teacher, and she loved it. She loved it. But that was just one generation away from me. I was told I could be anything that I wanted, and here I am standing up here preaching. Is my daughter going to have that same privilege? A few years ago, I absolutely would have said, oh, without a doubt, this is where we're moving. But it's not guaranteed right now. It's not guaranteed anymore unless we get curious about where we've been, who we are, and where we're going. And so I woke up this morning just kind of a little bit off. I know it's Mother's Day and everything, but it was just a little off. And I came across this posting from Heather Cox Richardson. I've quoted her a few times. She is a beautiful, magnificent woman historian from Maine, and she, for the most part, has kept a lot of people on the left sane throughout this whole process. She started just posting daily updates during COVID, and she kind of never stopped. But what I want to do today is I want to read what she wrote yesterday in regards to this country and Mother's Day. And it's a little bit longer, but I think it's an important message and possible lesson for us to take in as we think about and are curious about where we go from here. So this is what she wrote. If you Google the history of Mother's Day, the internet will tell you that Mother's Day began in 1908 when Anna Jarvis decided to honor her mother. But Mother's Day, with the apostrophe not in the singular spot, but in the plural, actually started in the 1870s when the sheer enormity of the death caused by the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War convinced writer and reformer Julia Ward Howe that women must take control of politics from the men who had permitted such carnage. Mother's Day was not designed to encourage people to be nice to their mothers. It was part of women's effort to gain power to change society. The Civil War years taught naive Americans what mass death meant in the modern era. Soldiers who had marched off to war with fantasies of heroism discovered that newly invented long-range weapons turned death into tortured anonymity. Men were trampled into blood-soaked mud, piled like cordwood in ditches, or withered into emaciated corpses after dysentery drained their lives away. The women who had watched their hale and healthy men march off to war were haunted by its results. They lost fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. The men who did come home were scarred in both body and mind. Modern war, it seemed, was not a game. But out of the war also came a new sense of empowerment. Women had bought bonds, paid taxes, raised money for the war effort, managed farms, harvested fields, worked in war industries, reared children, and nursed soldiers. When the war ended, they had every expectation that they would continue to be considered valuable participants in national affairs and had every intention of continuing to take part in them. But the 14th Amendment, which established that black men were citizens, did not explicitly include women in that right. Worse, it introduced the word male into the Constitution when it warned states against preventing male inhabitants from voting. In 1869, the year after the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution, women organized two organizations, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, to promote women's right to have a say in American government. From her home in Boston, Julia Ward Howe, who was a Unitarian, by the way, was a key figure in the American Women's Suffrage Association. She was an enormously talented writer who in the early years of the Civil War had penned the Battle Hymn of the Republic, a hymn whose lyrics made it a point to note that Christ was born of woman. Howe was drawn to women's rights because the laws of her time meant that her children belonged to her abusive husband. If she broke free of him, she would lose any right to see her children, a fact he threw at her whenever she threatened to leave him. She was not at first a radical in the mold of reformer Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who also was very associated with Unitarians, who believed that women had a human right to equality with men. Rather, she believed strongly that women as mothers had a special role to perform in the world. For Howe, the Civil War had been traumatic, but that it led to emancipation might justify its terrible bloodshed. The outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 was another story. She remembered, quote, "I was visited by a sudden feeling of the cruel and unnecessary character of the contest. It seemed to me a return to barbarism, the issue having been one which might easily have been settled without bloodshed. The question forced itself upon me, why do not the mothers of mankind interfere in these matters to prevent the waste of that human life of which they alone know and bear the cost?" Howe had a new vision, she said, of the august dignity of motherhood and its terrible responsibilities. She sat down immediately and wrote an appeal to womanhood throughout the world. Men always had and always would decide questions by resorting to mutual murder, she wrote, but women did not have to accept proceedings which fill the globe with grief and horror. Mothers could command their sons, who owe their life to her suffering, to stop the madness. "Arise, women," Howe commanded, "say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us wrecking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs." Howe had her document translated into French, Spanish, Italian, German, and Swedish, and distributed it as widely as her extensive contacts made possible. She believed that her women's peace movement would be the next great development in human history, ending war just as the anti-slavery movement had ended human bondage. She called for a festival which should be observed as Mother's Day and which should be devoted to the advocacy of peace doctrines, to be held around the world on June 2nd of every year, a date that would permit open-air meetings. Howe organized international peace conferences, and American states developed their own Mother's Day festivals, but Howe quickly realized that there was much to be done before women could come together on a global scale. She turned her attention to women's clubs to constitute a working and united womanhood. As Howe worked to unite women, she came to realize that a woman did not have to center her life around a man, but rather should be a free agent, fully sharing with man every human right and every human responsibility. This discovery was like the addition of a new continent to the map of the world, she later recalled, or a New Testament to the old ordinances. She threw herself into the struggle for women's suffrage, understanding that in order to create a more just and peaceful society, women must take up their rightful place as equal participants in American politics. While we celebrate the modern version of Mother's Day on May 10th in this momentous year of 2026, it's worth remembering the original Mother's Day and Julia Ward Howe's conviction that women must have the same rights as men and that they must make their voices heard. Thank you, Heather Cox Richardson. And what I also want to point out at the same time that we have these amazing role models of women who were fighting and dying for the suffrage movement, there was still racial discrepancy. And Black women and other women of color did not have an equal voice, did not have equal representation in that movement. So when we look at our history, we have to be curious, right? Some of these white women did amazing things. And they still had their own lenses of racial dominance. And so what I invite us to do this week, or maybe this month, or maybe this year, is to get curious about who are the other players in this game, the other women who were not named in the history books, right? There are a few names that I invite us to maybe think about and study and ask, do we know who these women are? There was during the antebellum, there was a small cohort of formerly enslaved and free Black women, including Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Maria W. Stewart, Henrietta Purvis, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Sarah Raymond, and Mary Ann Shady Carey, who were all activists in these women's circles. Do we know them? Did you recognize all of those names? Right? Most of us would say we recognized Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth. But there are a lot of women who we have tried to make invisible throughout history, and maybe it's time to not make them so invisible. And then there are some men that maybe we can get curious about. And they were the men who joined in their advocacy of women's rights and suffrage by prominent Black men, including Frederick Douglass, Charles Lennox Raymond, Robert Purvis, and they worked closely with people including William Lloyd Garrison, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. If we recognize the name of the white activists, maybe it's time for us to get curious and begin to recognize the name of the Black activists. And maybe that's our homework to do in the coming days and weeks and months, as a lot of those people continue to systemically get erased with the hope that they will become invisible, and it is our responsibility to not let that happen. So there's my uplifting Mother's Day sermon. So let us close today with 1031, filled with loving kindness.